Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into a startling development in the Baltic Sea region that may have major consequences for Russia's supply chain, and indeed for the broader strategic balance in Europe. Recent reports suggest that Denmark has taken action that could effectively cripple a supply line critical to Putin's ambitions. Let's unpack what's going on, why it matters, and what the ripple effects could be. First, let's set the stage. The Baltic Sea has long been a contested geopolitical theater. For Russia, maintaining maritime access and securing logistical corridors in and around that sea is vital. Whether it's shipping fuel, military supplies, or trade goods, any choke point or disruption can have outsized effects. Denmark, by virtue of its geography and its naval capabilities, sits in a position of influence. If it chooses to exert control or implement restrictions in key maritime zones, especially the waters linking Russia with the wider Baltic and North Seas, the impact could be severe. So, what exactly has Denmark done that people are calling a cripple to Putin's supply line? According to multiple open-source and journalistic accounts, Copenhagen has imposed or begun enforcing stricter transit controls or closures over certain sea lanes and straits that are important for Russian shipping. These measures may include denying passage, enforcing stricter inspections, or even blockades or de facto exclusion zones. The Danish government has legal and military capabilities to regulate traffic through waters under its jurisdiction, particularly in the Danish Straits, the Øresund, the Great Belt, and the Little Belt, which are the natural gateways between the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. Russia, especially its Baltic fleet and supply networks to Kaliningrad, relies heavily on these sea routes. If Danish controls hinder that traffic, Russia's ability to move supplies, fuel, materiel, and reinforcements may be significantly constrained. The effect would ripple across its operational readiness, particularly for assets stationed in the westernmost parts of its domain, like Kaliningrad, or for its efforts to influence naval operations in the Baltic and the Arctic. Let's consider some concrete mechanisms and possible scenarios. Denmark may, for example, designate certain zones as off-limits for Russian military or dual-use vessels, citing national security or alliance obligations, perhaps under the framework of NATO or EU sanctions. It might require military escorts, declarations of cargo, tighter inspections, or even the right to deny passage altogether. Additionally, Denmark could deploy naval assets or mine countermeasure forces to monitor and enforce compliance, effectively policing the routes. One can imagine that Russian ships, especially supply vessels, could find themselves delayed, forced to reroute, or even turned back. That means longer transit times, increased costs, and heightened vulnerability to surveillance or interdiction. In wartime logistics, delays and uncertainty are often as damaging as outright interdiction. Now let's dig into why Denmark would do this. First and foremost, Denmark is a NATO member and deeply committed to European security. If Moscow is engaging in aggressive posturing or trying to project power into the Baltic, Copenhagen has strong incentives to restrict Russia's operational flexibility. Furthermore, Denmark, like many northern European states, is sensitive to Russian provocations in the Arctic and Baltic corridors. By asserting control over its maritime domain, Denmark can act as a bloc in the Western strategic front against Russian ambitions. There's also legal precedent. Nations controlling straits or connecting waters often have rights under the law of the sea, treaties, and customary international law to regulate passage for security reasons. Denmark may argue that extraordinary circumstances, especially with ongoing tensions and Russian military actions, justify stricter rules of engagement in its waters. That said, Denmark would need to navigate international law carefully so as not to be accused of illegal blockade or excessive denial of innocent passage. Imagine, for instance, a Russian supply ship trying to pass through the Great Belt. Under new Danish policy, perhaps it has to slow, report its cargo, allow physical inspection, and submit to escorts. If Denmark decides that certain cargoes are disallowed or that certain classes of military or dual-use vessels are prohibited, some shipments might be turned back entirely. The cumulative effect would be to constrict Russia's maritime logistics footprint in the Baltic. Now, Russia is unlikely to take this passively. Several countermeasures are possible. 1. Moscow might attempt more aggressive maritime maneuvers, pushing through Danish zones and accepting diplomatic fallout or escalation. 2. Russia could escalate military pressure, naval harassment, aerial show of force, or submarine operations to deter Danish enforcement. 3. Russia might respond politically, seeking to overturn or mitigate Danish measures through legal mechanisms in international forums or pressure via allies and neutral states. 4. Russia can shift more supply to overland routes, though those have their own constraints, especially given sanctions and the geography of Eastern Europe. The key question is whether this Danish move truly cripples Putin's operations, or whether it is a strong symbolic step with limited operational effect. The answer likely depends on scale, consistency, and enforcement. If Denmark follows through resolutely, with naval assets and legal backing, it could force Russia to scramble alternative routes, slow down supply chains, and complicate military planning. One should also consider the broader alliances and how NATO, the EU, and neighboring states might support or coordinate with Denmark. Denmark's actions could serve as a model or trigger for other Baltic littoral states, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, to adopt similar transit restrictions or maritime controls. That would multiply pressure on Russia's Baltic maritime routes. From a strategic standpoint, that scenario magnifies the importance of the Danish decision. Additionally, the move sends a diplomatic message that Europe is willing to turn strategic geography into leverage. If Russia's naval options are constrained, Russia's ability to threaten or project into the Baltic to supply its forward forces or to reinforce certain positions diminishes. Some caveats to keep in mind: maritime restrictions are fraught with legal and operational risk. Denmark must tread carefully to avoid accusations of improper blockade or violations of the right to innocent passage. Russia might challenge the measures in international courts or retaliate diplomatically. Furthermore, if Denmark overreaches, it could provoke escalation or clashes at sea. The enforcement costs may be high: monitoring, interdiction, naval patrols, and potential confrontation. Also, Russia may find workarounds, submarine routes, covert transfers, or clandestine smuggling if tides and geography permit. Moreover, the impact might not be uniform. Russian naval craft or supply ships with immunity, escorts, or flagged through third nations might still gain passage, and sanctions might already have restricted some Russian maritime commerce. The Danish measure might add strain but not fully disable Russia's capacity. But even if partial, the psychological and strategic effect is powerful. The perception that Russia's supply lines are vulnerable, even within what it might regard as its own maritime domain, has ripple effects. It forces Moscow to divert resources to protect those lines, to reconsider its operational plans, and to reassess risk tolerance. The reputational blow also matters. It shows the West's resolve and signals that geography can be weaponized. Let's consider some likely immediate outcomes. Russian ships that carry arms, fuel, or material to Baltic ports or naval bases may start observing longer transit times or forced detours. The Baltic fleet might lose coordination flexibility, especially in reinforcing forward deployments. Moscow may scramble to reassure its regional clients and bases, injecting more redundancy and security into its supply routes. On the diplomatic front, Russia will likely protest vigorously, lodge legal challenges, issue threats of retaliation, and press its allies to mediate. Denmark might receive diplomatic blowback or pressure, but its allies may back it. Longer term, we could see an escalation in naval posturing in the Baltic Sea, a more concentrated NATO presence, intensified surveillance, and possible showdowns in contested waters. Russia could invest more heavily in anti-access area denial, A2AD zones, submarines, and missile systems to protect maritime corridors. On the other hand, Russia may shift investment into land corridors or logistics nodes inland, reducing dependence on vulnerable sea routes. From Europe's side, this move strengthens deterrence, making any Russian aggression costlier and riskier. Baltic states may feel bolstered. It also underlines the strategic importance of controlling choke points in maritime geography, especially when applied in concert with military alliances. In sum, the Danish action, if it is as substantial and enforceable as reports suggest, could indeed deal a sharp blow to Putin's Baltic supply lines. Whether cripple is hyperbole depends on execution, pushback, and Russia's adaptability. But this is a pivotal moment. A relatively small country using positional leverage to strike at the logistical arteries of a much larger adversary. As this situation unfolds, we'll need to watch key variables: how rigidly Denmark enforces restrictions, how Russia reacts militarily or diplomatically, whether other Baltic or North Sea states follow Denmark's lead, and how supply routes adapt or reroute.